All right, I think we are set. Welcome everyone. I just want to first thank Stephanie for having us here for World Childless Week for this conversation. I am Katie from the Childless Collective, and I am really excited to be joined by four amazing panelists for our conversation today. We are going to be talking about tuning out stigma and cultivating self-worth. So, as we're getting started here, I would love to just remind everyone that you can participate in the chat, and we will have a little bit of time for questions at the end. So if you have a question, put it in the Q&A because it's a lot easier to find it there than in the chat where it's moving quick. Okay, so let's just go ahead and jump in. I would love for y'all to introduce yourself. So let's start with Aisha.
Okay, so hi everyone. I'm from London. I'm born here. I live in London, and my infertility journey started around 13 years ago when I couldn't fall pregnant, but I'd been complaining of like bleeding and pain in my teens, and I saw several doctors, and none of them believed me. And it was only when I couldn't fall pregnant that I asked them if I could be self-referred to a fertility a hospital that specialized in fertility. And then the next 10 years looked like a diagnosis of endometriosis, 3 major operations, 11 plus rounds of unsuccessful IVF, 4 miscarriages. And in 2019, I decided to leave the process without a baby because I just couldn't take the mental difficulties, physically, the financial hits. And it's like the best decision that I made. And I don't regret walking away without a baby.
Thanks, Aisha. I'm familiar with your story because I've heard you tell a lot, but I'm like getting teary just hearing you say all of that again. It's just so much to have gone through. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And man, we have some complex stories here in this community. Okay, so Helen, let's jump to you next.
Sure. I'm Helen. I live in the US. I live in Oregon, which is on the west coast of the US. And I also experienced infertility, went through about 3 years of treatments and also experienced some pregnancy losses and unexpected diagnoses, and ended up also choosing to end the process in 2020. So not too long after you, Aisha. And yeah, I agree. It was the right decision for me. It was definitely a difficult decision to make. And I'm sure we'll get into talking a little bit about the impact of that in our discussion. But yeah, now I've been kind of rebuilding a different life and different path over the last 3 years. And yeah, I'm happy to be joining you all today to talk a little bit about that.
Thank you. Welcome, Helen. And Tiffany, I'm just going in order on my screen here. Let's do you next. And I love your like representing the child-free, childless stigma with your shirt there. My boring English child-free life. Amazing. Um, yes, go tell us about yourself.
So my name is Tiffany. I'm from Ontario, Canada. I also was diagnosed with infertility, but so was my husband. So we both had a diagnosis. They gave us all of the options, and we actually just opted out of everything before we even started. So we decided that we didn't want to go through IVF. We didn't want to try any sort of other medical things. We didn't feel called to adoption, and we kind of just stopped the process before it even started. So that was back in 2016 or 2017, I think. And we've been kind of just embracing a life without kids ever since. And I kind of view my infertility as a bit of a gift in that sense, because it's really opened a lot of doors for connection, kind of like this webinar and the writing I'm able to do. So it's kind of nice to see the silver lining in that a bit.
Thanks, Tiffany. It's good to have you here. And Alicia.
Hello, everyone. I am joining you from Southern California, so I'm here in the US. I personally identify as child-free after infertility, and I'll talk about that in just a second. But I do want to name my pronouns are she, her, and I identify as a Latina living in the United States, which is sometimes a very complex journey in this infertility experience as well. My infertility journey actually started in 2014, and in 2014 and 2015, I had 2 chemical pregnancies. And after that is when I actually sought medical intervention. Did very little of that before deciding that it was not the road for me. In a lot of my reflection and healing over the years, I have come to recognize and accept that a lot of the difficulty in this journey has been to accept that I actually was a fence sitter. I was having a really challenging time going through some of the medical intervention and treatment and considering foster or adoption when internally I actually really was not sure it's something that I really actually wanted. And so I openly do share about how that's been a struggle, and also just kind of recognizing sometimes the cultural and social pressures that I felt going through that experience as well.
Thanks so much, Alicia. So it's so great to have you here. This conversation, I think, is going to be a really good one. When I saw the theme of today of We Are Worthy, this piece of stigma immediately came to mind for me of what I thought would make a great webinar topic, because I think it's one of the things that can really impact our self-worth. And so I'm excited to jump into this. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes here kind of framing up the conversation, and then we'll get into some discussion here. So to just give a kind of definition of what we mean when we say stigma, I looked into the research. The kind of standard definition that gets used is that stigma is a combination of 5 separate factors that all have to be there in order for something to be considered a stigma. The first one is that some kind of differences in humans are identified. The second is that the identified difference has a label to it, and the label is something that is seen as undesirable or linked to characteristics that are generally considered to be undesirable. The third thing is that then you get 2 distinct groups that form, some kind of us versus them. And then the fourth is that the group receiving the stigma is then plagued with discrimination and loss of status. And then the fifth is that the dominant group exercises power over the group that's being stigmatized. So I looked into this within in like research literature and found that there is some literature around stigma being attached to both child-free and childless people. And I won't go into all the details of what came up because I don't know. I think we all feel a lot of these things as we're interacting with the world and from the messages that we hear. But some of the main things that came up are that people who don't have kids are selfish, that we are cold, that we might be immature, or that we have like low life satisfaction. So those are some of the stereotypes that came up in the literature that get kind of put on people who are childless and child-free. And so one thing that I found was really interesting as preparing for this webinar is that there's a difference between stigma that is being put on you from society or from other people versus self-stigma. So self-stigma is when you take those messages and you internalize those beliefs and you apply those to yourself. So you start to believe the things that you're being told about yourself. And so what's great about identifying the difference between those two things is that research does show that there are reduction strategies for taking that stigma and applying it to yourself. So we can actually reduce the self-stigma that we're attaching to ourselves. And some of the things that came up in the literature were altering or questioning those beliefs, building new coping skills, having self-compassion, going to therapy is a big one, having community, self-expression, being able to tell your story and your experience, and then building self-esteem. So I did do a poll in preparing for this on Instagram stories. So I had over 500 childless people respond. And I asked, do childless people face negative stereotypes? 93% said yes. And again, this was over 500 people who were childless that responded. I asked, due to being childless, have you felt judged or negatively viewed? And 90% said yes. I asked, has being childless negatively impacted your self-worth? 84% said yes. And then I asked, if yes, have you found ways to rebuild your self-worth? And in that, 59% said yes. So I think that's really important because it does show the difference between 84% saying that their self-worth has been impacted by not having kids, versus 59% saying that they found some strategies that have helped them rebuild their self-worth. And so that is what our conversation today is going to be based on, is these, what does stigma look like in our community, and what are some of the things that we can do to kind of counteract that and not apply that self-stigma, so that we can develop that self-worth. So I'm just going to go ahead and kick off the conversation now. And I'm excited to hear what all of you think about these topics, because I think this is it's a big, juicy topic. So I think we're going to get into some good stuff here. So the first question I'm going to ask is, how have you seen stigma show up either in your own experience or within the childless community? And I'll just open it to anyone who wants to go first.
I'll start if that's okay. Katie, when you were talking about the self-imposed stigmas, I was like, ding, ding, right there. I had a lot of internal messages that I continue to repeat to myself, which is definitely impacting me, not so much in a positive way, about being childless and questioning my worth. And I think someone, I don't remember who it was, it might have been a therapist or a friend or someone in my social circle, said, well, like, how many times do you hear that? Like, do you hear it often? And then I paused and I realized I actually don't have a lot of people telling me that all the time consistently. It was myself consistently telling myself those negative, like, sort of messages. And so I think when you mentioned that right now, that just really hit me, in the sense that just felt really relatable about how I was actually taking those stigmas and creating my identity in that way during some of those more challenging times.
I think for me, within my family, I had a really supportive network. So my parents were very supportive. My in-laws were very supportive. And I chose to tell a select, amount of friends who I really trusted. And they were all really supportive. None of them had faced infertility, and they didn't really know what it meant. But I didn't have the pressure from, my immediate family to try and conceive. But I did feel the stigma when I went to weddings with the wider South Asian community. So for those who don't know, I'm half South Asian. And I had a lot of questioning, as soon as I got married, it's like the year later, people coming, feeling the tummy. And it's really embarrassing. And there's a lot of shame, because there were people who got married the same time with me, even cousins of mine. And they kind of all had a child, and then I didn't. And then the next year I didn't have a child, and the year after. And people don't shy away from asking these questions in front of a lot of people. So that's why I feel like childlessness has to be intersectional, because in terms of the South Asian community, and I'm generalizing here because each household will, react very differently to childlessness. There are layers and extra burden from like tradition, culture, even religion, and if you're living with your in-laws, it can be more problematic, because when they mean family, they mean children. And also, like, your extended family aren't seen as extended family, they're kind of immediate family, and they'll come over and their children will come over. And also, if people have more traditional views, they might think that you're not being a good practicing Muslim. So there's kind of all these layers, and sometimes I think we have to look at the nuances of an individual circumstance, and how stigma shows up in their situation.
That's a really good point, because I always have people kind of coming on my page and asking, like, why does this even matter? Why do you need to be talking about this? And I think, especially being in North America and having a largely white population, people don't see, like, yes, there's been progress here. I still get a lot of hateful comments, but not having kids isn't as big a deal. Whereas I have people commenting from India or Mexico or all of these places that culturally it's so different and it's such a big deal there still. And they're expected to have children, and there's no excuse as to why you shouldn't have children. So when people talk about, well, we don't need to be talking about this, like, yeah, as your standard American family, maybe you don't, but if you look outside your own little bubble, it's still a huge issue in a lot of other places.
Yep.
Tiffany, I'll just say though, because one of the reasons that I really wanted to get your thoughts on this panel is because I think of all of us here, I'm not sure why. I have some theories, and I think maybe part of it is because you identify as child free on your Instagram account, but you tend to get these like negative, nasty comments all the time that I definitely don't get, and that I don't see a lot of other like Instagram accounts in the childless community getting. And so I know you've got your fair share of like you get a lot of these messages. Like I'm just curious how you manage that, or like does that, because when I see the stuff that you respond to with the comments, I'm like, I don't think I could keep my Instagram account going if I was getting these messages all the time. And so I'm really curious like how you have managed that.
I
Awful.
think for me, it's been easy to just think like so many of these comments, like I can see how it's almost never about me. Like the comments are directed at me, but people, you get the comments of you're going to be sad and alone and all of these things, but like I look at my own life and I have community around me. I have a husband, I have a sister, I have family. Like it very much often feels like the people commenting are seeing someone living outside of sort of the binary life and thriving in that, and they just, I guess it makes them mad. Like we were kind of talking in like the group chat about how people without kids kind of have a tendency to relate it to coming out or racism or something, and like all of these things tend to just be outside of your sort of typical assumption of what life needs to look like. And I think a lot of people just are uncomfortable with that. And even, I've had a few parents apologize for their comments because they're like, I realize it's coming from, and granted, apologies are few and far between. I think I can count on one hand the amount of times someone said sorry for what they've said to me. But like so much of it is sort of their internalized assumptions of what life should look like and discomfort in seeing people thriving outside of that.
Yeah, thank you. I've been curious about that. I feel like I would be like, I don't know if I could have the like fortitude that you have in just dealing with those comments. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. I'll just add to with as we're talking about kind of different parts of our identities, or like where we get this messaging from and how that might differ. Like I was raised Mormon, and in Mormon doctrine, like having kids and being, yeah, it is like so attached to your experience that it's actually in the doctrine of the Mormon church is like that your purpose is to have kids, and that if you don't have them in this life, you become a god and you have kids in the afterlife and you populate your own planet, and it's like a whole thing. But it's actually built into the doctrine that that is like the only purpose of life. It's like why we're here. And so even though I wasn't Mormon when I was going through therapy for this, I found that those messages just were so ingrained in there. They were really hard. Like I was still unpacking them just based on how I was raised and the messages I was getting all grown up. So it is complicated. I think we get these messages from a lot of different places. So okay, before I move to kind of the next question, Helen, did you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I think for me, Aisha, I'm glad you brought up intersectionality, because one thing I've been thinking a lot about is, I'm a transgender non-binary person, and the kind of intersection of the expectations that were put on me. I was assigned female at birth. I was socialized and raised as a girl and a woman. But that was never how I identified. And so I really struggled with that kind of internalized self stigma of, great, well, not only can I not live up to this gendered expectation of who I was supposed to be, because I'm not that, but also I can't live up to having children. And that's just another way that, the gendered expectations are not, I'm not fulfilling them. And so that has been a long process of unpacking for me and coming to terms with the fact that some people are just never going to understand or accept who I am and how I identify. And, I think, Tiffany, you mentioned some people drawing the, comparison between coming out as LGBTQ and coming out as childless. And I will say those have been very different experiences for me. When I tell people that I can't have children, on an individual basis, what I face is, there's some judgment, there's definitely some stigma on an interpersonal level, but I'm not afraid for my safety like I have been in some other circumstances when I've shared my gender identity. And I also, I haven't experienced that fear of losing a relationship or entering into kind of a debate about my validity as a person. So, and I'm certainly not, not an expert on these topics, and there are other people who can share personal experiences. I can't share from personal experience the differences between that stigma and racism, but I would say in a similar way, as white people, we need to be careful the parallels that we draw, because there's a difference between the stigma that childless people face and the really institutionalized, longstanding, systematic way that racialized people, BIPOC people experience life. So that's something that, I know we talked a little bit in our group before about how stigma may show up in our community as well.
Yes, I'm so glad that you brought that up, Helen. It's something that I've seen, specifically the one you talked about of hearing people, compare their experience of telling people that they are childless, or being public about it, telling people at work, whatever it is, like comparing that to the experience of coming out. And I just want to echo what you said there, because I think it's really important for our community to, in order for us to be a strong, thriving like community, I think we need to be aware of the intersectionality that we have here, and the different experiences that people are having based on the identities and specific experiences that they may be having. So I just wanted to bring that. I'm glad that you brought it up, and I just want to echo it, because I think that it's really inappropriate for us to be appropriating someone else's experience if we're straight cisgender, to say this is like the experience of coming out. So I'll just leave this open for a minute if there's other things that we want to talk about, because I think this is touching on something that's really important that I haven't heard discussed much within the childless community.
I've even noticed within some of the comments that I've got that the childless and child-free content tends to be a sort of launching pad for some people to go into other deeper issues. Like, there's been kind of an uptick in the discussion around people not having kids and people voluntarily opting out. And then this so quickly sort of ends up being talks about immigration, and then it leads into racism. And like, I try and keep my eye on the comments and delete those comments, because like I'm not going to allow any sort of discussion about that. But there's been a lot of times where it starts as people saying, oh, you need to have kids, oh, it's awful of you to not have kids, and then it ends up being hateful towards LGBTQ people, hateful towards different races, and like it ends up really being a launching board for so much more hate. And I can't imagine what it's like to be a creator in that space and seeing that stuff. Like, I'm very much privileged in being a cis white woman, and I can easily delete those comments, but like, I don't know, it's wild to me that it ends up being so much more hateful than just being like, you should be having kids.
Yeah, I've got some of those on my account too, from white supremacists jumping in and putting stuff in there related to children and stuff. And it is a very, I think that's why this intersectionality piece is important. We need to recognize not just our own personal experiences, but how this is impacting those who hold other identities or experiences that are marginalized. So I'm gonna keep leaving this open, because again, I think this is really important, and then we'll get back to the specifically like childless piece after. But I want to stay here for a minute, because I think this is a really good discussion.
Thank you, Katie, for kind of leaving this open for a little bit. I think one of the things that was and still is, I'll be really transparent. I'm sweating right now. I'm nervous because I realize I'm showing up in a space that I'm not usually invited to, and I'm just gonna say that might feel controversial. But when I came into this childlessness community, And I still do see this. I don't see a coach that looks like me or identifies like me. I don't see a therapist that identifies like me or looks like me. So to be able to make connections and feel actually a sense of belonging is a challenge. And so almost to feel like I'm stepping out of the comfort zone. I don't know that I actually have a comfort zone, because I don't know that I've actually sensed or felt that, because I'm always entering spaces that have predominantly been, white leadership or white. In my work, it's white leadership. In here is I see a lot more, again, the voices that are amplified are not someone that looks like me or someone that looks quote unquote, othered or different. And I think that is a challenge. And when we are constantly talking about, we welcome people and we want everyone to feel included. But it's hard for someone to feel included without even speaking, just by looking at pictures and people's names, that, oh, that's not someone that I might be able to have a safe conversation about, when I'm already coming with something that has been, stressful and traumatizing. And so I think when we think about our childlessness, it's, I'm childless and, I'm childlike for myself. Like I said, I'm cisgendered. I'm in a heterosexual relationship. I'm married. But I'm also Latina. I'm also neurodivergent. I'm also, am living a life recovering from different traumatic experiences. And so that is something, kind of something that Helen talked about, is just like, I can 100% vouch, like having traumatic racial interactions from when I was tiny itty bitty as a little child all the way up until present day. I get gaslighted all the time. I'm dealing with that and my childlessness and all these different things. And so I think just realizing that we are so layered, which makes it a beautiful experience to be able to interact and connect and have these types of conversations. But sometimes I think we forget that the other people that we're interacting with have all these different layers that we may not actually be exposing, because right now the commonality that we have is the childlessness sense.
Yeah.
I think for me, it's, there are certain intersections that make up me that give me disadvantages. So one would be that I'm visibly Muslim. As you can see, I wear the hijab or headscarf. The second would be my ethnicity. I'm South Asian. And then it would be that I'm a woman. And then it would be that I have a disability, chronic illness, and then childlessness. And I think this conversation isn't about shaming anyone. It's about not even educating, really. It's about just creating that awareness that to compare two totally different things just wouldn't do justice to either intersection. So I think childlessness deserves a space for its own merits. I think comparing that to race is very damaging, because it's systemic, it's organizational. Brown and Black people fear for their lives because of how they look. They have barriers to promotion, healthcare, many other things. But like Alicia said, I can also recognize, my privilege in other ways, where I'm a fairer skinned South Asian person with blue eyes. So I'm going to be treated very differently to a brown or a Black person wearing hijab. So I think it's important that all of us recognize, our privileges, even within the intersections that we have, because that can make a really big difference. And me and Alicia often have these discussions between us about being othered in lots of other ways. Because we share very similar parallels, and sometimes we do feel like we don't always fit in because of all the layers of what we have, but we're trying because we want other people who look like us to feel included. So so it's not to shame people, it's just widening the conversation about this.
I was pausing to see if anyone else was wanting to respond. So was there anyone else who wanted to respond on like this topic before we move into the next piece of the discussion?
I just want to acknowledge Aisha and sorry, just real quickly acknowledge Aisha and Alicia for sharing your experiences, because I know that's uncomfortable, and it's, I just want to remind us white folks to be cognizant of that when we're in our spaces. So just to put a finer point on it.
I also want to thank you for sharing yours, because I know that can also be really uncomfortable as well. So thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'm sweating as well, so I'm right there with you.
Can't tell.
Yeah, I want to thank I want to thank all of you because I think these conversations are happening in the background a lot of the time between people who share similar identities, and that is where the safety is to have those conversations. And I realize this is a very different thing to be having a webinar where you're sharing that experience, and there is a level of, am I going to be safe here? How is this going to be perceived? How, like you said, I don't often see people that look like me or share my identity that are talking about this publicly. So I just really appreciate you being willing to share your experience and to come on and talk through this, even through the sweating. I just want to acknowledge that I yeah, that concern is valid, and I just think you're very brave, and I'm really glad that you're here and that you are part of our community and that you're willing to use your voices to help create that representation, so that because I know there, even just in the comments that I've been seeing, like there are people who are on the call watching who are feeling validated by what you're saying. So yeah, just thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna just I mean, it's all interconnected. So I'm not saying like, oh, this conversation's done. We're going to continue this as we weave through these other discussion topics. So the next thing I wanted to ask was, how do you think the childless community can counter stigma and negative stereotypes as a societal level? So we're going to start broad and look at kind of, yeah, societal pieces of it. What can we do as a community to kind of start pushing against that?
Okay, I'll start then. I also want to say, because, I know I'm talking about intersectionality a lot, but also when I gave the previous example of someone maybe living with their in-laws and they're surrounded by people who don't always understand the journey, I just want to say, look, sometimes, people in a certain situation might not be able to get rid of the stigma because it's just surrounded by them. Sometimes, counseling, therapy, coaching is not something that's widely accepted or acknowledged. Sometimes that can also bring shame, like, why are you seeing a counselor or therapist? So I just want to validate anyone who's feeling that they can't get rid of this. Actually, that's okay too, because it's sometimes we can't get rid of it, and sometimes we don't need to either. So that I just want to say, number one. Number two, I think a lot of the time, even in the childless space, we talk about either grief or living happily, and I think the whole area is nuanced. Sometimes it's not about grief or triggers, and I feel like the word trigger in our community is just overused. Sometimes it's being uncomfortable and discomfort. And I would encourage, if not necessarily if you're in the depths of grief, but further on in your journey, if avoiding situations, it kind of, to me, it delays the process. Like showing up and being uncomfortable, that is okay. You don't need to get over your childlessness. People might want you to, or even internally you might feel like, I need to do this, but it's okay to be sad about something. But it's just like listening to the messages of, I don't have children, it's okay to be sad about it, but to believe that you can't have a happy life, that's another thing. So being sad about your childlessness to me is fine, but there is room for happiness, and leaning into the discomfort is also okay.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I've spoken about this a bit. Like, I often sort of present myself as a child-free person. I don't talk about my infertility a lot because I don't, I guess, identify with it as deeply anymore. But like, I've told a lot of people, like, even if you're completely content in your life, like, I'm quite a few years down the road of healing. We're confident we don't want kids, but there's still times I feel sad. Like, a friend of mine just had a baby not too long ago, and she'll send me videos, and like, it kind of pulls my heartstrings a little bit. Like, I could have had that. I could have been experiencing these moments, and I kind of just sit with that for a while, and it goes away. And then I enjoy my nice quiet coffee and my nice quiet house. So like, I think we do need to do better at being able to hold both things. You can make the right decision, and that decision can still be a sad one, and you can still find so much joy in life, and there's still going to be sad moments. And it's okay to have both. It doesn't have to be like either you're in the depths of grief or you hate children and never want to be around them. Like you can experience both things.
Yeah, I think everyone, as you both have mentioned, I think everyone has their own individual role to play in their own individual contexts. And some people may have discussions, they may have access to people who are willing to listen. And that's one way that we can talk about it. We can also, it's also totally fine, like you said, to just live your life. And that in some ways, just in and of itself is combating stigma, because we can be full people. I know that's one thing we hear often, that we're somehow incomplete if we don't have kids, right? Like you've never experienced love until you have a child. That's something I'm sure we've all heard. And, we can live our own full lives on our terms. And just by kind of quietly doing that, I think that's enough as well. But there are people like, several of you on our call today are very vocal, and that is a very important role, to be a public advocate, to be willing to share some of the tender moments, some of the kind of tender and difficult feelings that you're having, as well as the joys that you have. So, I think we all have a role to play. And I think, the old cliche of, there are no small roles really applies here, because everyone can live the life that they want and have that be part of our community, part of our movement.
I think one of the things for me, I've thought about, it was a colleague I think had mentioned to this maybe not too long ago, and she just reminded me of that. As women, we often, and I identify as a woman, that's why I'm sharing this particular point. And as women, a lot of time the expectation is that you're always like apologizing for things that you're not able to do or that you're not doing right. And I think I said sorry in a meeting or something one time, and she's like, you need to stop apologizing. Like, this is usually imposed on us. And I was like, yeah, I apologize for lots of different things. And then it clicked for me in that moment that like, I apologize a lot of times too for being childless. Like, oh, like I feel shame and I'm sorry that I can't do this. And then I said, well, I'm just going to try a little bit of an experiment and stop apologizing, but also change the tone that I have when I do talk about being childless, and start saying like, yeah, I don't have children, or I'm like, or I'll say, oh yeah, I'm not a parent. I'm like, and then I'll segue into something that's positive. Sorry, there's a grandfather clock here where I'm at. So you're gonna hear chimes in the background. But when I started to change how I presented myself and how I was talking about being childless, I noticed a shift in people and how they were receiving me. And that really just, again, reminded me is how I show up in spaces and how I present this part of me to others. And that's definitely created a huge dramatic change for myself. And so realizing that sometimes, when we were talking about child-free and childless identity, I think Tiffany, you were talking about this, and how people come into your comments and how they respond to those. If I present in a more positive way, then I don't get as much as the pity that I sometimes often see, but then also realizing that those who do identify as child-free sometimes get more of the anger. And so realizing that there's an emotional shift that happens when we talk about these different types of identities and issues that come up related to not being parents. And so I think that that's just one thing that I think, if anything, is how do we show up when we are talking about ourselves and this part of ourselves.
Also, I just want to add to that, like, how to combat stigma in a wider society. I think when you feel more confident about your journey, that also makes a really big difference. Because now I'll go to a South Asian wedding, and if someone asks me, I'll just be like, no. And it makes it, I'm not uncomfortable, because really I couldn't care less, but they're uncomfortable, and then it just shuts the conversation down. And I think helping me to become more confident was definitely therapy. Like I said, again, that's a privilege. I was able to, afford private therapy, and I know not everyone is able to do that. But even if you can't do that, like talking about it amongst your close friends, like I think sometimes internalizing it is a lot more difficult, because validation is important. And as much as I always have been a person who really hasn't cared much about what other people think. My mom's like that, my sister's like that, and that's been ingrained in us when we were younger. So I think quite differently to other people, but even when I was childless, it did bother me. in my first couple of years when I was experiencing fertility, because I didn't know anyone else who was in a similar situation to me. But further along my journey, I started to become more confident in who I was, because before I tried starting to conceive, you know, it didn't enter my head about what people thought about me not having a child. I mean, I couldn't care less. I didn't even think about it. So now when I show up, you know, you can either choose to tell people about your story if you think it's safe, or you just shut it down. Like, you don't owe people an explanation. And I don't need to do, or we don't need to do big things because we're not parents. You know, I know I'm saying that, and I kind of coach people who are childless not by choice, and everyone here does their thing. But even just like Helen said, like showing up quietly, even for yourself, you're still paving the way for other folk who don't have children. You know, quietly or loudly, it doesn't matter. You're still doing you. And lastly, the other thing is I really try to stay in my lane when it comes to anything in life. Like, I know it's this cliche about comparison is the thief of joy, but when it comes to anything, finances, holidays, other people, childlessness, I literally just focus on me. I don't care what other people are doing. You do you, have your 5 kids, you know, have a yacht. I couldn't care less. Staying in my lane is what really you know, allows me to focus on, you know, the things I have and I want in my life. So that way I'm tuning out noise, because it doesn't matter to me. Like, what I'm doing is what's important.
Yeah, it's a great point about like you being confident in talking about things, because I've noticed that too. And oftentimes, if I'm talking about it, I'll say childless, child free. And I think even bringing up both of those things at the same time makes other people uncomfortable because they aren't sure where to, like, what box to put me in. Like Alicia said, if, you know, you bring up childlessness, you get a lot of pity. Whereas if you say child free, you often get a lot of hate. You're either sad or you're selfish. But I've started now saying both, and you can kind of see the confusion in people's faces when I'm talking to them, like, oh, like, do I need to be sad for you? Do I need to be angry? Like, it kind of stops them in their tracks. And I've noticed that when other people get uncomfortable, if I take that on to myself and become uncomfortable, it really changes the tone of the conversation. Whereas if I kind of just let myself be comfortable in my space and leave them uncomfortable, like, that's not my problem. They have to deal with that. And the conversation can kind of continue without any sort of awkwardness. So it really is kind of you just showing up confident in your own story, in your own life, and not letting other people's emotions or reactions impact that.
Yeah, I want to thank you all for sharing your thoughts on this piece. I think I'll just add that for me, some of the shifts that I've seen even just in the last 5 years, since I started my first Instagram account around being childless, is that I do feel like there's been a shift even in just the last 5 years of the way that we're talking about it and how many people are talking about being childless and child free. So some of the things I think really excite me when we're looking at these bigger kind of this societal level and how do we kind of break through on that front. Um, you know, getting anytime we get like media coverage where we're able to tell our stories and to maybe have opportunities to educate journalists about what is the difference between being child free and childless and how are we using the correct terminology. And I think it's, you know, we're still having very basic conversations. I hope that that continues to grow where we get to have more nuanced conversations about, well, is it just child free or childless, or is there a lot of in between, or do we not all, you know, fit neatly inside of boxes? So I think that having these conversations publicly for those who you know, are wanting to do that, I'm seeing a shift there. Like I'm seeing way more social media accounts that are focused on this and just more people sharing their stories, more people talking about it. It just feels like the last 5 years from when I started to now, it feels like there's a big difference in public awareness. And, you know, some of that is bad, like in terms of that you're seeing a lot of backlash, I think, with child-free women who are sharing their experiences and then getting like attacked or getting, you know, there's just been a couple of instances here in the US in the news lately of that happening. And but I think that it's what's needed, right? We need to be we need to be supporting one another in sharing our stories and in amplifying each other's voices and kind of just getting more representation out there. And I think that goes for like the childless community as a whole, but then also representation within our communities so that, you know, like it's already been mentioned, people can see themselves represented in the people that they're hearing from. And I think getting to share our stories to the general public or like building broader awareness, I think it does help to kind of counteract some of those stereotypes because it's hard to put someone in a box and say, oh, this is the stereotype I have about you, this is who you are, if they're hearing from multiple people saying, actually, that doesn't fit with my experience, and here's who I am, and here's my story, and here's what I've seen in the community. So I'm just really encouraged by the growth that's happened, I think, with people talking about it more publicly, and I hope that continues. So we have about 13 minutes left. So let's jump into my last question that I have for you. So we talked more of like the societal level, and I think we touched a little bit too on kind of this personal level. But what have you seen in terms of like how childless individuals can tune out negative stereotypes and cultivate their own self-worth? Like how do we not internalize those messages that we get? Because it's like you said, Aisha, there's a lot that we can't do, right? Like those do exist, those stigmas and negative stereotypes, they're out there. How do we protect ourselves from that and develop our own sense of self-worth so that we don't internalize that stigma?
I'm gonna go. So I think with that, you know, other people's opinions about our life without children is just that, it's an opinion. It's not a universal fact. Also, many of us are in a position where it wasn't a choice. You know, I'm not talking about people who were actively child-free, but people who didn't choose to be involuntary childless. There's really nothing we can do about it. So I kind of view a lot of the opinions about childlessness or people's opinions about my life as it's an opinion. And it's like, just say like you know, would I value the opinion of a heart surgeon or someone that read a book and had an opinion about a heart? It's kind of the same thing to me. I just tune out to it. And I think, like I said, having the confidence to show up as who you are makes a difference. But not even just with childlessness. I think in the South Asian community, and here I'm generalizing again, being single is still stigmatized, divorce is stigmatized, not having children stigmatized. My sister and my sister-in-law have one child, that's stigmatized. Like, why would you only consider having one child? So there's all these, you know, varying degrees of like stereotypes and, you know, prejudice. You know, there are all different layers. It's not only childlessness. There are a lot of things that people don't have that are going to be stigmatized. And, you know, I think we have to, we kind of owe it to ourselves to, you know, live the best life that we can, despite some of the things that we don't have, because otherwise it becomes a case of, you know, do I try and live the best life I can with something I didn't get to choose, or can I keep focusing on what other people say? And a lot of times it is about what other people think. And, you know, just recognizing, you know, that again, it is okay to have that discomfort. And yeah.
A lot of the time I always try and think like, who is profiting off of this narrative? Because it's rarely ever us. If you look at that even within like, you know, the beauty industry, who's profiting off of telling us that aging is unattractive? It's not us, and it's not unattractive. It's the beauty industry pushing these things. So like when people say, you know, if you don't have kids, you're going to be lonely, or your life is going to be empty, or whatever, like who's benefiting from that narrative continuing? Because individually we all know it's untrue. Those are lies. It's a narrative that's being pushed. Like, you know, it benefits the fertility industry, it benefits lots of other people that are not our community. So thinking about, where does that narrative come from? Who's profiting off of it? Is it really something that I need to listen to and buy into, or do I kind of deep down know that the truth of that is, it's a lie?
I think for me, it's been kind of a practice of really remembering that and reminding myself that. And it's, you know, it's easier now than it was at kind of the beginning of my experience of being childless. But I think it really is for me, it's really been a practice. It's been practicing remembering, like you both have said, this is someone else's opinion. It doesn't need to apply to me. I'm just kind of repeating that to myself and repeating to myself that, as much as I believe deep down that this was the right decision for me, technically, I probably could have continued in the journey to becoming a parent, but in some ways I did choose to not pursue those options. And in some way I did choose this path. And I don't need to apologize for that. I don't need to explain it. And just kind of reminding myself of those things has been very helpful, difficult, but helpful.
I think to echo everything that everyone has said, and I think at the end of the day, I had to, at least for me, again, in my own personal journey, I had to kind of realize like, how much will I be willing to continue to push myself into trying to fit into these expectations, and what was the personal cost? For me, it was my mental health. I can't do this to myself to continue. I can tell internally I'm suffering and I'm having a hard time meeting these expectations. So if I took these expectations out of the equation, what would be the possible outcome? And just making tiny baby steps to get to that point. I think there's not an expectation on how we're supposed to heal or how we're supposed to navigate grief. Everyone has their own journey and how they go through that. Everyone has their own process in making the decision to continue through with certain things. And I think that sometimes I sometimes will get questions on like my DMs, and they'll say like, so like, how did you do it? And I'm like, there's not a magical formula that I think people want to hear. And I myself, I'm one of those people that, hey, can you just tell me what's the quickest way to get to the end so I can feel better? And my therapist wisely reminds me, like, slow is fast. And I'm like, I know. I'm like, but I really want just the fast, like, fix of it all. And so sometimes I have to have that gentle reminder that to do these different steps and increments that are smaller, because those micro changes actually have more of the sustainable like change that I'm wanting to see in myself, and how I'm just living my life in this identity as myself. And so I think that that's something else that realizing, just kind of again echoing all the pressures it sounds like everybody is talking about from all these different angles, and realizing how can we kind of navigate through that.
Okay, so I'm just going to add to all of what you said, which was great. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. I'm just going to reiterate what came up in literature around this. So in the research literature, if you're looking at how do you reduce internalizing that stigma and turning it into self-stigma, some of the things that came up were being able to alter your beliefs around the situation. So if you're getting like a negative message, or you find yourself believing something negative about yourself in relation to being childless, like, this means I'm worthless, or, whatever it is that you're telling yourself that maybe you heard from someone else, and you're internalizing that message. And that being able to counter those beliefs and really dissect them and alter them is one way. Building new coping skills, increasing your self-compassion, going to therapy is a huge one. Connecting with community and others who will understand. Having self-expression and being able to share your experience, and then building self-esteem. So I think just wanted to like add those in here, because I think as people are maybe wanting to get ideas about where they could start, in addition to what y'all said, I think those are some other things that you could start looking into. So I know we just have a couple minutes left. We've got a few questions here, so I think this one's a really good one. So someone asked, tuning out stigma and developing self-worth is a process. How many years did it take you to start feeling more confident in dealing with stigma and cultivating self-worth? And do you still get triggered?
For me, it took me probably about a good 2 years to start feeling more confident. And in answer to the last question, yes, I still do get triggered. I think that's something that for me probably won't ever fully go away, but I am building more tools to deal with that. But I think it's different for everyone.
I would say my process was a little bit faster, but only because I think because we didn't do any sort of medical intervention, we didn't do IVF, like we quickly accepted a life without kids. So I think that was kind of paramount for me to kind of just fully embrace that to heal. And I sort of fairly quickly after that as well kind of looked for community and kind of started my own Instagram page. So my healing journey maybe was kind of more towards a year to fully acceptance. But, you know, even now, like 5, 8, whatever years later, there's still moments that I'm sad we don't have kids. And I don't think that ever fully goes away. I think it gets easier and those times of sadness kind of get shorter. But I think if you were at a point where parenting was something you were considering, it's probably always going to be a little bit sad sometimes.
I think for me, it took about a couple years, kind of similar to what Helen mentioned. And I would say 2 years of deep, real intentional work. Like Katie mentioned, therapy, having to do a lot of self-introspection. And I like to compare it to like an onion where you just peel away like all the layers little by little. And so I feel like I'm at a good place of acceptance and embracing a childless life, but I was just dealing with a trigger like a couple weeks ago. And I'm still like dealing with it a little bit, not intensely, but just, kind of having those like self-reflection moments that don't bring up a lot of emotion, but just more of like, it's something that I need to sit and examine a bit and seeing how it's showing up for myself. And so I think that not to say that grief is forever, but in a sense, it is in this of how it's impacting us as we continue to encounter situations that may have similar emotional responses and things. And so I think your grief stays the same, but we start to grow bigger around it, and we have those coping skills that we build around it, which makes it sometimes feel like it's smaller, but it's still there in the background, kind of like an app that's just on your phone. You kind of don't always shut it off, but it's there and running.
I mean, I can answer, or you can ask another question. I don't really mind.
And I would love to hear your thoughts if you got some.
Okay, just so very briefly, because I know that we're running towards the end. I really don't know. My journey was really long. And the reason why I share the fact that I did so many things, it's not because it's a badge of honor. When I left the process without a child, for me, I was actually quite embarrassed about the length of time I spent trying to conceive. So I really don't know when my healing journey started. I was convinced I was always going to have a baby because I'd got pregnant many times and I had a very late miscarriage with twins. So, when you get pregnant, you kind of, and the further along it goes, you feel like the next time it's going to work, and it kind of just went downhill from there. So I honestly really just can't remember, but I know that therapy really helped me. And like I said, being confident in who I am, kind of really staying in my lane, not comparing my journey to other people's or my life to other people's. And also like writing, that's really cathartic for me, connecting with so many of you. Also, before I even started doing what I do, just Instagram, seeing other people that were leading a really happy life without children, that was definitely kind of a light bulb moment for me. And I really appreciated a lot of the people, you, Katie, one of them, really showing that actually, do you know what, this didn't happen, but this can happen, this can happen, this can happen. That really helped. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing. I know we are just about at time. Well, we are at time here. If we did 2 more questions and went for, I don't know, like 5, 7 more minutes, does anyone have a hard stop right now? No, okay, let's just go a few more minutes. I'll just say an answer to that question. I think for me, kind of like you said, Aisha, I didn't have quite as long of an infertility journey as you did, but I've spent about, I don't know, 3.5 years kind of going through infertility, and I think I did a lot of grieving during that time, and then it really shifted a lot once I had my hysterectomy. It was like a very different. I think it helped actually to have that like very final like this is a hard stop, and now I'm in this new phase. It was like a definitive like closing of a chapter where it's like today is the day that there is literally no chance I will have a kid. So it gave me kind of that peace of mind to just like close that and open something new. But I think that it probably took me I was experiencing depression and a lot of grief for probably another year after that. And then that's when I started to, I think, get a little bit more proactive about wanting to talk about it, wanting to connect with people. And that's when I started my Instagram account and started making those connections and meeting other people. And I think that led a lot to my healing was meeting so many amazing people in the community who didn't have kids and being like, wow, all these like stereotypes that I held and that I thought were true or that I was like thinking about childless people are absolutely not true. And I can now tell you 100 people who like totally defy that stereotype because they're just like the most amazing people. And so I think it was like in making those connections and really exploring it. And that it started to shift. And I'm with you, Aisha. I think the word triggers is really getting overused, and it's getting used to really just mean anything that makes you feel upset in any way. So I'm not going to use the word triggered, but I will say I've been trying to replace it with a word that was suggested by my friend Tanya Hubbard, of activated. So my grief does still get activated. I have a lot of feelings that will come up around certain things, but it's way less, and it's like you said, Tiffany, when it comes up, it doesn't last as long, and it's not as deep. So, but yeah, I think being childless can impact so many different areas of our life that there's a lot of shifts in our circumstances or shifts in family dynamics or shifts in friendship dynamics or all these different things that can happen that I think can make you have to reevaluate, go back, figure out how your childlessness now intersects with this new dynamic that's in your life. And that can create situations where there's always some like reframing and refiguring things out and bringing emotions to the surface again that happens as those shift. So yes, I still definitely experience those moments, but I am also at a place where if someone said I could wave a magic wand and put your baby in your arms right this minute, I would actually say no, because what I have built right now in the life that I have right now, a kid wouldn't fit into it anymore. Like it's not, I've moved beyond that desire. And so that's a weird thing to say because it's not something I thought I would ever feel. But that is actually where I am at currently. And I think it makes those moments a little bit easier to deal with. Like, yeah, the grief still comes up, but I'm also able to appreciate the other things that I enjoy about my life that have come from being childless, I guess. So it's complicated. Um, okay, so I think this is a really good conversation or a good question. So someone said, I have a 7-year-old nephew, and I'm wondering how we can adapt conversations that are directed or in an environment with young people that can help alter stigma. So I don't know if you have little kids in your lives in different ways that you interact with, but have you had a specific approach to how you have those conversations so that you're kind of busting that stigma for a new generation, I guess.
I can kind of speak to that actually from experience as a young child. I have a large extended family, and I have several aunts who don't have children. I have a great aunt who's close to the family who doesn't have children, and it could have been handled, I think, in a different way that was maybe more affirming. Looking back, hindsight's 2020, of course. But what I was told was just that some people have kids and some don't, and that was kind of the end of it. And as a child, I think as children we often just accept what we're told as fact, and that was really the end of it. As I got older, I think I did kind of start asking questions of other relatives about why those particular relatives didn't have children, and we had a little bit more of a nuanced discussion. But honestly, as a kid, I think just that simple message was enough for me.
Yeah, I think we can often like overthink things like that. And it's just really simple change of language. Like some people have kids and some don't, or if you're, talking to people and, young kids and you say, if you have kids one day instead of when you have kids, like presenting that as sort of an option of both is really all people need to do. I don't think we need to go into nuance when they're young, and you don't need to make a big deal out of it. You just need to kind of present it as a normal path. Like that's kind of what the difference is going to be made in.
Exactly the same as Tiffany. So I have a nephew from my sister's side. I have 5 nephews, but in the South Asian community, everybody is niece and nephew, cousins, kids, or niece and nephews. So everybody in my family who is married, has children apart from my husband and I from my side. But with my sister's son particularly, I mean, yeah, we do the same thing. It's not like when you get older and you get married or when you have kids. It's you may not, whatever makes you happy type thing. Even like when he sees something on TV that he doesn't understand. Once he saw a man wearing makeup, and my sister was like, look, people, wear different things, and it's okay that people do certain things, So it's just explaining that everybody has a different way to live their life, and how everybody wants to live their life is okay. So just, planting the seed that there's not one way to kind of, how your life should look really. So that when he grows old, if something doesn't happen, it's not disappointing for him.
I'd say I've just echo everything like what you were saying, Tiffany, about if you want to have children versus like when you have, so when we use that subtle language change, that's what takes the pressure off of people, kids and young adults. And I work with a lot of young adults in my job, and primarily I would say 99.9% of them are female. And so I hear them like in their little discussions, like, oh, I need to get married, and then I need to have a baby. And I'm like, oh, and so I openly actually share when I introduce myself every year when I during orientation, I'll say, this is who I am, this is my name, here's a picture of my family. I will just name it. I'll say I'm childless after infertility. So I don't have children, because then the questions do come up sometimes, like, well, what do you do with your baby, or what do you do with your child at home? They do teach in child development, and I'm like, I won't be able to answer that question. Or like, what was your birth story like? I don't have a birth story. And so I just automatically already put it out there to, one, avoid the questions, but also to model what a family can look like that doesn't involve children. And I have had former students come back up and say, you actually taught me what it looks like to actually live a life without children. And it doesn't mean that she's going to choose that for herself, but just being able to have that alternate like identity and image.
Yeah, thank you all for sharing. I think about this a lot because I have 7, soon to be 8 nieces and nephews, and the ones who are older, they have been around for a big part of my infertility and childless experience. I, am a pretty open person, so I have cried in front of them. They've seen I was staying at one of their houses during my my first surgery. They've really seen some of what I've gone through, and I always worry, like, are they only seeing the grief? And it's been really fun for me. I have like a few nieces that are older now, like in their teens and early 20s, and they follow my account, and I'll see them at leaving comments and liking my stuff, and they'll talk about something that they saw in there, and it really has made me feel good to see that I don't know, maybe in some way I'm helping to kind of create a different narrative for them about like that it's okay no matter what happens in their life. Like you all said, like, maybe you'll grow up to have kids and maybe you won't. Maybe you'll get married, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll get your dream job and maybe you won't. Like there's no guarantees in life, and just also opening that door to choice too, right? Like you might not get married because you might not want to. You might not have a kid because you might not want to, and like helping to validate that like whatever it is that you want to do, like it's up to you. So I just added Instagram handles for my panelists if you want to connect with them. And does anyone have any closing thoughts here as we wrap up? Last words you want to get in?
I'd like to say, if anyone could take something away from this, it's that, everyone's life looks different and there isn't a right or wrong. It's what's right for you. Sometimes we don't have choices in life, and and that's really, really difficult. But for me, and I know this won't be for everyone, but a childless or child-free life is not an empty life.
Thank you,
I don't
Aisha.
think I could say
I'll
anything better.
Yeah, I
No.
know. I was gonna say, I just want to second that. And if you're feeling like that's not true, connect with community, find other people who are also childless that you can connect with and get to know, because I think that's the best way to um just kind of counteract these negative messages, is to see that it's not the case. I mean, there's no way you can get to know people in this community and still hold those negative stereotypes, because it's just not possible with how many amazing people are here. So, I want to thank everyone who joined us, and I think that's going to wrap us up. So thank you to Stephanie for hosting us, and then to my amazing panelists for joining and taking your time to, share your experience and your thoughts on this subject.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thanks everybody. And thanks, Katie, for moderating this.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And thank you for all the comments and questions. I think you can see community is right here, sharing different tips and different validation of each other and everything. And that's just, I think, why we're here, is just to validate, bring awareness, and show up for each other. Because I think that there's a lot of power in community and healing.
And I also say I recognize so many of the names in the comments. So, people that follow me, you don't go unnoticed. I recognize so many of your names. Also, my sister's on here, so I want to say hi.
Aw, that's so sweet.
She
Yeah,
was
same.
vegan.
I love how many people I've gotten to know. It's the same thing. I'm looking at the chat and just feeling like, oh, I've got friends here. So
Yeah.
yes, community is important. Connect with people. It'll help you feel less alone and help to give some examples of counteracting those stereotypes that you may be internalizing. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thank you for joining. Stephanie, I think you can go ahead and stop the recording now.